Welcome to Digging Deeper Moments, a ministry of Eagle's Nest Church. We hope a few minutes from our studies will lead to a better Bible study for you. If we open to the beginning of the New Testament, Matthew chapter 1, you know what you're going to find, a genealogy. And that genealogy is the ancestry list of Christ. And I'm supposed to say at this point, don't skip over this. This is very important. And then you think, sure, lots of important history stuff in there, history guy. Yeah, I'm sure you're terribly enthused by it. You're not still going to make me like it, though, or even really read it. And I guess this is where I'm supposed to plead with you to give it the old college try. But I'm not, because honestly, I'd rather skip it too. But I do think it's interesting that Matthew's list is in here because, he's aiming at a Jewish audience. So, of course, genealogy is so important to them. Of course, it's there. Except, if it was all about just genealogy, then in keeping a family record, this seems to be happening for the first nine chapters of the Chronicles scroll. Matthew's just given us a neat and tidy highlight reel. 14 great-great-grandparents from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian exile, and then 14 from the return from exile to Jesus himself, for a total of 42, all holy numbers, to really emphasize son of Abraham, son of David, totally legit Messiah. Jewish audience, of course. Except, Luke does this list too, but his is a little different. And it's just a little different because it starts from the very beginning with Adam, because he's got mostly a Gentile audience. They want to feel included too. And then he finds a different set of great-great-great-grandparents to follow through David's son Nathan, because most likely he's talking to Mary, and that's Mary's side of the lineage. And then Matthew, of course, traces through Solomon, Joseph's side, but is also showing a direct connection to a claim on David's throne that appeals to their sentiments and their biases. Of course he is. There's our overview of the genealogy. Okay, so great. We don't have to read that genealogy. We could actually, move on. Except, if we did read this genealogy, then we'd see that there's not exactly a clean explanation for what Matthew's doing here either, because Matthew does something that the other good Jewish genealogies don't do. He includes certain women. Mary, Jesus' mother, and 4 other of Jesus' great-great-great-grandmoms in what is supposed to be a patriarchal heritage for a very patriarchal society. Everyone knows that there had to be a mother with each of those fathers, of course, but why does he include 5 times these named women, risking his male Jewish audience by insisting on naming these women, especially the women he names? The last 2 in here, Mother Mary and the millennium before her, Bathsheba, both were chosen and impregnated out of other lives with little or no agency of their own. But the first 3 females in here were of a different category. Looked down on based on the station they found themselves in, they did have agency to take on what was put on them head on. A disobedient widow, a prostitute, and an enemy foreigner are now here, proudly listed in the genealogy of Christ, because the Jews that followed after considering Jesus' messiahship also considered these women, and they considered them righteous. Righteous, even with those credentials. But how? Let's dig deeper. Traditionally, we say Moses wrote the book of Genesis. He might have had other scribes come along later to shape the storytelling of it, but whoever did, they placed the story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis chapter 38 with purpose, right between Joseph being sold into slavery in Egypt in chapter 37 and Joseph's running of Potiphar's house and running away from Potiphar's wife in Egypt in chapter 39. It's supposed to rhyme with both chapters. It is supposed to parallel the first story with the presence of Judah, the use of a young goat, deception with a garment, and a question. Can you identify who these belong to? As a moment for self-discovery. It parallels the chapter that follows by being both a story of seduction by 2 very different women with 2 very different responses and 2 very different results, but both ending in the same place. Tough but necessary spiritual growth for Judah, then Joseph, with that growth bringing their two stories back together one day, but then they're the best versions of themselves. In the meantime, the sexual issues of this family are on a whole different level, but we have to be aware to understand what's going on. So, of Jacob's 12 sons, Reuben was the oldest, the firstborn, and the first in line for inheritance and blessing, but he kind of slept with his dad's concubine and mom of two of his half-brothers. When Jacob found out, then Jacob's one daughter, Dinah, was then raped by a local Canaanite prince. And in response, the next two sons in the birth order, and Dinah's full brothers, they took out their vengeance disproportionately on the whole kingdom of that prince, killing all the men. Jacob was furious with his first three sons, and he wasn't going to give any of them his birthright authority and blessing someday. That means his fourth son, Judah. He should receive the headship status and blessing someday if he found favor in his father's eyes. Except, favor in his father's eyes now belonged to Joseph. So in chapter 37, we can see Judah's heart by him helping to dispense with Joseph. And then he goes further down this path in 38, further away from his father's God. We read in Genesis 38, it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He took her and went into her. And we know what that means. And over time, she bore Judah 3 sons. And Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. 2 things. Judah hangs with his new bestie and marries a local woman. Both are Canaanites, and they're pulling Judah away from Yahweh. And we quickly see the results. His sons will have Canaanite values. But as we'll see, they seem to learn them from both parents, not just mom. Secondly, I hope the wording, and the Lord put him, Judah's first son, to death, doesn't mess with your theology too much. Everything good or bad at this time in history was attributed to God in the writing. All we know is that he was so against God's character, he was struck down before he and Tamar could have children. And it's time to get uncomfortable about the sexual stuff again, because then Judah said to Onan, "Go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of brother-in-law to her and raise up offspring for your brother." But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he went into his brother's wife, he would waste the semen on the ground so as to not give offspring to his brother. And what he did was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he put him to death also. It's called a Levirate marriage, and it's Latin for husband's brother. And it will become acceptable practice even in Mosaic law and in the rest of the Old Testament within Jewish culture. An unmarried brother marries the childless widow of his deceased brother. The main purpose was to provide the first child as heir to carry on the dead brother's name and inheritance and provide for the widow. That was before Social Security. That was who was going to take care of her. But it seems Onan knew that their first child would inherit the firstborn of Judah's status over him. He was willing to forfeit his own family to keep his brother's child from being better than him. But technically, he could have also said, "No, thank you," and moved on with someone else. There's a whole refusal ceremony that develops because it becomes common. We'll see it in the book of Ruth. But let's just say Onan apparently doesn't want to pass up the opportunity to be with his sister-in-law. And just for his own gratification, Tamar is simply used. So how did God feel about that? Well, 2 brothers get struck down somehow, but the one thing the text makes clear, in God's eyes, Tamar is not to be blamed. Oh, but Judah does. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Remain a widow in your father's house till Shelah, my son, grows up." For he feared that he would die like his brothers. So Tamar went and remained in her father's house. Judah is blinded by his own Canaanite thinking. He doesn't consider what offends the one true God and why his sons probably were struck down, something at least he should have understood. He just thinks like a pagan here. His daughter-in-law must be somehow cursed. A few years later, when his son Shelah, his final and third son, was grown, Judah's wife dies. He mourns, but then goes back to his life. And soon his flock of sheep need to be sheared, as he did every year. Apparently, this is a routine that Tamar is aware of because Most likely she once had two husbands who traveled with and helped their dad on this annual pilgrimage. So again, for emphasis, notice how Tamar can predict what will most likely happen when Judah is done bringing in his yearly harvest of wool. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, "Come, let me come in to you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. There are only two possible excuses for Judah here, and both are not good. As he says later, he thought she was a local called prostitute, and he approached her on his way to shear the harvest looking for a favor from a Canaanite god. Or he was done his days of shearing. He had money in his pocket. He and his bestie were tipsy and were celebrating, and he was just looking for a way to finish celebrating. Well, let me summarize for time. They agree on a payment, he and Tamar, and it's a young goat, because she knew he wasn't going to be able to pay immediately. So she asked for what she really wants as collateral until she gets the goat, and that's his signet, cord, and staff. His signet was his ancestral personal ID that usually hung around the neck that could be inked or pressed into hot wax as his signature or seal of approval on business deals. Having the cord attached to it meant it usually wasn't stolen or ripped away. It was given willingly. The walking staff usually had the markings of your tribe or your family, maybe Jacob's family, and your position in leadership of your people. And then Judah, well, he got what he wanted, or so he thought. Whether it was the veil or strong drink, or it was candlelight, or he really hadn't seen his daughter-in-law for a few years, or all of the above, he didn't know who he was with. But just think what would have happened to Tamar if that veil had slipped, or he'd been just a little bit more sober. It is such a high-risk plan with no margin for error. Why would she do it? Judah sends his friend, what's his name? Hira, the next day with the goat to pay and collect his personal belongings. He may have had a hangover, but it's more likely he didn't want to be seen looking for a cult prostitute in broad daylight, for some reason. But the men of the town tell his friend they don't even have a cult prostitute in their town. Judah doesn't know what to think now, but he would rather lose his identity than possibly have a word get back to Jacob or his brothers or others about this. Apparently, the truth he thinks he's hiding would threaten his standing somehow, but it's actually worse. 3 months later, Judah is told Tamar, who was supposed to remain a widow, still bound by betrothal to his final son, she's pregnant, and by someone not his son. In fact, they're alluding to prostitution. Most likely, this leak came from Tamar herself. Judah is livid and says, "Bring her out and let her be burned." He is gathering quite a crowd for quite a display for everyone to know how he has been so wronged by this woman breaking a pledge. Well, never mind, he was never going to fulfill it anyway. And finally gives him the excuse he needs to get rid of the one who has cursed his family. And as they drag her out, Tamar knowingly shows her hand. In her hand was a signet, cord, and staff. She confesses they belong to her co-offender, to Judah and his family. In front of such a crowd, the men who already recognize what they're holding when she hands it to him, well, they turn around and they walk up and hand Judah his own signet, cord, and staff. It is this moment that is the pivotal point of the whole story. Not just this story, but of Judah's life story and his family to come. The Canaanite daughter who had this life chosen for her, forced on her by this man to begin with, made sure this very public moment happened to finally push back and force Judah to face himself with nowhere to hide. Then Judah identified them and said, "She is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Wait, what? What she did was righteous? Wait. Some of us would have a hard time seeing her as the good guy here, okay? Because it sure looks like she pretended to be a prostitute and she seduced the man. and after he lost his wife and was vulnerable on top of that. So how can Moses and Matthew depict this woman in the right? Well, again, first, Tamar did not risk her life attempting something that didn't already have a precedent of happening. But secondly, the key to her righteousness can be found in the verse before, when Moses is retelling this to the people of Israel who understood the Levirate marriage very well. As she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, intentionally, because his original audience would say, hey, that's right. The Levirate marriage, fine print. Here we go. If the deceased husband's brothers were not available, for whatever reason, the next kinsman redeemer, who was supposed to provide her with a child or release her from the family obligation, was the deceased husband's father. It is absolutely not the culture we live in today, nor is it a necessity for survival like it was for them. But we can appreciate when the Bible doesn't shy away from what really happens. So we can see that even in the messes that we make, no matter which culture, God can still move. Judah made the last son not available, but he wouldn't release her from the family betrothal to punish her. So Tamar forced Judah into the final option that he had, and thereby forcing him to keep the law as he should have. And from that moment of public humiliation forward, Judah is a changed man, completely changed. First, since he has fulfilled his legal obligation to Tamar, he doesn't continue to take advantage of Tamar, like previous Judah might have done. And for the rest of the story of Genesis, all the way to the migration to Egypt years later, we find it is Judah who is trusted to speak on behalf of the brothers. First, to Jacob to let Benjamin go to Egypt with them, pledging he will give his life to protect the youngest brother. Then to Joseph, disguised as the second in command, the Egyptian vizier of Egypt. He proves his oath by ironically offering himself as a slave to Joseph instead of Benjamin, to the very brother who years before he had the evil idea of selling into slavery in the first place. And it is Judah who cites this as the key to their misfortunes, as he confesses, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants." Does this sound like the Judah who wasn't paying attention to God or even raising his sons in the knowledge of God either? But it is because of Judah's humility in speaking for the family that Joseph knows their hearts have changed, and he breaks. He reveals his true identity and God's plan to save them. What happened to Judah? Tamar happened to Judah. And she not only gave him twin boys to carry his legacy forward, she gave him the moment of clarity, the epiphany that he needed. His words and actions can best be described by the Hebrew word shuv, to return or go back. And he does, to the things of God that he had forsaken. Not just laws, but humility and sacrifice before God, as well as thinking of others over oneself. This is where we get our understanding of repentance. Everyone sees it in Judah, but we never read about it in the hearts of Reuben, Simeon, or Levi, his three older brothers. And when we get to the end of the book and Father Jacob's deathbed prophecies, the three older brothers' descendants are diminished because of what they had done in their lust and anger. But Judah is given the future royal leadership over them all because of his repentance, which means he becomes the ancestor of David, and then finally, the king whose reign will never end. But Matthew was right. We don't have this story of Judah without Tamar.